Welcome to SnapSessions, a podcast that looks at artists and activists and their creative pursuits, as well as producing articles on politics and entertainment. My name is Doug Nunn. I'm joined by Techmeister producer Marshall Brown and by our artist activist of the show, environmental scientist and muckraking journalist, Evan Mills.
Support for SnapSessions is brought to you by listeners who contribute generously at our link, patreon.com/SnapSessions, or through the link in the SnapSessions website, thesnapsessions.com, and also the link in our show notes. Thanks to our Snappus Maximus contributors, Ron Huxbrook and Rick and Henny Newman, and to our supportive snappers, Ellen Athens, Peter and Sheila Jowers, Kathy White, Dominique Jowers, John Bird, Gabriel Geiger, James Bartlett, and Christine Samus. Other contributors include Steve Weingarten and Jerry Shook. These supporters help keep SnapSessions snapping. Join the SnapSessions family today.
In 1999, I moved to Los Angeles to pursue cartoon screenwriting and to work with the improv group Los Angeles Theater Sports. I was asked to produce their upcoming show, Shakespeare Unscripted, to be directed by Dan O'Connor and Brian Lohmann. Hear now the story of how Shakespeare Unscripted came to be.
I'm here with two of my favorite improvisers, Dan O'Connor and Brian Lohmann. And Dan and Brian, I have been working with for Brian around 35 years and Dan about the same, I guess. These are two of my favorite people to have fun with on stage and also to be ridiculed on stage by. And we'll get into a few of those moments as well. Good to have you both here. Dan got here first, so let's say a short bio, a short Dan auto bio.
First off, Doug, thanks for having Brian and I. I guess I grew up as a child actor in San Francisco. I did the Young Conservatory at ACT and actually was on TV on KRON, which is another story where Brian and I almost were connected at that point. And then I went to drama school over in England. And when I came back, was an actor in San Francisco and got turned on to theater sports. And along with Brian, was part of the original Bats crew in San Francisco, and then moved down to Los Angeles to start my acting career here and teamed up with a couple of expat San Franciscans, Ellen Idelson and Forrest Brakeman, to form LA Theater Sports, which eventually became Impro Theater. And while we were still LA Theater Sports, we started doing Shakespeare Unscripted and improvised Shakespeare when Brian moved down here. And actually, we were doing a little bit before he moved down here. But yeah, that's the brief, Dan. I've had a career as a writer and a director and an actor in Los Angeles, and I've been here since 1987.
My goodness, that's right. And you know, you've maintained your San Francisco fandom for all sports teams, San Francisco and Bay Area ever since.
Yes, the only LA team I root for is the LAFC, the soccer team. Aside from that, it's all Bay Area.
Good. I had to get that in. Great. And Brian, how about a short intro from you and about how you connected with Dan for the first time?
Sure. Dan and I led sort of parallel lives in San Francisco. The child acting that I did was at the local museum, at the DeYoung Museum, which was down the street from me in the Richmond district. But I'd always wanted to be an actor, and that they had a program where they did some plays. I kind of got the bug there and wrote my first play about the Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Cleopatra in that program, which is yet to be produced. And then got into improv in high school in San Francisco. It was an English elective at Washington High when I was there. So my teacher, Mary Idiacides, who was married to one of Dan's producers at KRON when he was doing Kids Watch at KRON, formed a group out of our class with Diane Amos and Lori White and me and Mary and John Farmer and Chris Prey, who had been with the committee and Pitchell Players. We started performing in clubs in North Beach right when I'm out of high school. So my journey onto the stage was really the improvisational sketch comedy satirical review stage in places like the Spaghetti Factory and the Savoy Tivoli, and then worked in commercials, some bit parts in movies in San Francisco, but continued to do improv when I went back to San Francisco State and joined a group called Fault Line that Reed Kirk Rollman had started. in the dorms, and that group played the South of Market scene in the mid 80s and kind of got into the new wave punk aspect of improv. Again, a satirical review where we had political sketches, but we also did improv, and we did one long form piece each half. First half, we did an improvised Shakespeare show, which was about 20 minutes. This is 1985, 86. In the second half, we did an improvised musical, also about 20 minutes. So I was experimenting with long form then and interested in how long you could sustain it and do the stories. Then Dan and I met in 1986 when the first theater sports workshops were being held with Fratelli Bologna, and Rebecca Stockley came down to teach us some of the games and the theories of Keith Johnstone. And then Dan and I both got super excited about it and said, let's make a theater sports team league in San Francisco, a company. And we helped form Bay Area Theater Sports.
And thus began a comradeship which has stayed together to this day. And I got to know you guys right around then. Brian and I were part of the Bootlicking Snarling Weasels in the Edinburgh Festival in 87. And of course, I got to know Dan through one of his KRON teammates, Tracy Burns, who was my comedy partner at the time. And so I got to know both of you. And by the time I moved down to LA in 99, you guys were already germinating the idea of Shakespeare Unscripted. What I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, you guys took me to breakfast one day at that place that's right near the freeway on-ramp.
Cafe 101.
Cafe 101. Thank you. You guys took me to Cafe 101 and said, Doug, we got a proposition for you. Here I am, kind of a wide-eyed knucklehead showing up from NorCal who likes to work for theatrical causes. And you said, Doug, why don't you produce Shakespeare Unscripted? Brian and I will work on the content, etc. You be the producer. We'll coach you on what to do, etc. Suddenly we were talking and I thought, I got to be part of this. Talk to us about the origins of Shakespeare Unscripted and how you guys came upon the idea.
I think, like Brian was saying, he had been doing it with Faultline a little bit, and we had been doing it with Triple Play, which was something that Forrest Brakeman came up with, because we tended towards genre stuff. We tended towards musical stuff very early on in theater sports, because we realized everybody loves to close a show with a song. So we got more and more into doing that, and Triple Play was a format that Forrest came up with, which was a play, a film director, and a musical style, the first acts of each, then second acts of each, then third acts of each. So you'd see 3 different plays during the course of an evening, and it could be, Shakespeare, Steven Spielberg, and Sondheim. And we were very cavalier at the time because we were all quite young and full of confidence. We would just ask the audience for genres. And that morphed. We realized, if we really want to do this well, we need to rehearse the genres. We can't just, we would get things like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Wim Wenders, and the Weavers.
Yeah,
that was literally one of the genres we did. We did the Weavers as a musical play, and we did Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And this is without rehearsing, magic realism or anything like that. We started doing that, and then when Brian moved down, and Brian and I had worked together, on and off, even though we were living in different cities, and really wanted to do this. 1, because it was just so much fun, but 2, we knew that all of our sort of acting class training and drama school training and things like that would come in handy. And to be able to do genre work without it just being parody, that was a very interesting dynamic. In fact, I think in the early days, we actually attempted to improvise one of Shakespeare's histories, but a made-up king, which was, we found out very quickly, intensely boring. And also, I think we did tragedies. We really swung for the fences. I think the very first incarnation, it was me and Brian, and I think Bushnell, wasn't Bushnell one of the first directors?
Yeah, that's right.
So Dave Bushnell, and we had a cast of 16, but we wanted to do something epic. And in West Hollywood, as you remember, Doug, Thad, I can't remember Thad's last name, there was a guy who owned the Globe Theater on Kings Road and Santa Monica Boulevard. It's still a theater today. It's not the Globe anymore, but it was designed like the Globe Theater in London.
Yes.
So it had a trap door, which is a dangerous proposition for improvisers.
Yes.
Because you never know when someone's coming through the floor. But I think that was our first foray into doing a full-on improvised play. And I should say parenthetically, and I'm sure Brian can add to this, but 90% of the improv world is the Herald, is jazz, is basically verbal jazz comedy. And what we were trying to do was unscripted theater. And that's still what we're trying to do to this day. So I'm very quick to say to somebody, it's not long form, even though it is a longer form of improvisation. It's unscripted theater because we're trying to do a play from soup to nuts. We're trying to do everything.
Going along with this, and we'll talk more about it once we get into what your job was as a producer, Doug. Dan and I were interested in a theatrical experience for the audience, not just, let's have people in black pants and colored shirts on stage moving blocks around, but how can we make it feel like you're in a theater watching a play and you start to get sucked into it and suspend your disbelief and really go on the journey with these characters? So we wanted to explore costuming, we wanted to explore scenery, lighting, all of the things that really make it possible for audiences to disappear into the play and get caught up in the story. I think that's part of the difference, Dan, that you're talking about with the long form Harold Armandos of the world, where there are almost like mosaics, fragments of narrative that are then pulled together and we see the larger picture once the mosaic is made. We wanted to do a more traditional form of storytelling where we established who the main characters were, what their obstacles were, what their objectives were, all that good actor training stuff that we'd been immersed in. And what happens if the actors write the play based on what their characters want and what they recognize as their roles in the play? It was pretty brave. Most playwrights sit down and go over it and redraft it and do multiple iterations. And we wanted to see what it was like if the first draft was what you saw on stage in performance. Yeah. Could that be entertaining? And apparently, to certain people, it was.
And it's also a team written thing, getting on the same page with a group of performers so that you're driving toward an end goal is rather a challenging idea. And that brings me to one of the questions I was going to ask it a little later on, but I'll ask it now. Once you got together and you had presented me with the idea, hey, Doug, let's be involved. Of course, I was very interested. LA Theater Sports at the time had weekly workouts. I think it was Tuesday night in downtown Hollywood there. I knew that Dan was directing, and each week we would concentrate on some aspect of improv, some group of games or something like that. And when you brought the Shakespeare idea in, you workshopped it for, I think we did maybe 6 to 8 weeks of workshops before we went on stage at the Globe in West Hollywood. Talk to us about how you sort of built that practice schedule and what you were conceiving, because I remember some great games where I'll sort of pop in after you get it going here.
Well, one of the things we did, which Brian and I felt was really important at the time, is we brought in Sabin Epstein, or Epstein. I can't remember how Sabin pronounces his last name. But Sabin had run the conservatory at ACT and was an accomplished actor and director and had directed all over the place. And in fact, directed me in Midsummer Night's Dream at A Noise Within down here. But we brought him in to kind of cement the idea of looking at Shakespeare the way actors look at Shakespeare as opposed to the way improvisers look at Shakespeare. And so during those weeks, we had Sabin come in, we invented things. I think Brian did an amazing job of inventing improv or repurposing improv games to drill Shakespeare technique and Shakespeare tropes, more about technique and language. So we had this base, and I think thinking back about it, one of the reasons why we were a good team as directors is because Brian brought a very, really great base knowledge set about language. And I think that I was able to complement that in one way or another, depending on what we were doing. And Brian can talk more about it, but the invention of or repurposing of improv games to learn Shakespeare for improvisers was terrific.
I'm going to grab a notebook. Hang on.
I did want to say one thing, Doug, earlier about about the fact that we were really trying to do an homage to Shakespeare and not a parody. So much theater sports Shakespeare was just adding TH to the ends of words.
I go it. He cometh.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. And we really wanted to be good at doing it and move people. And that's a Johnstone thing. Why do you just have to make people laugh? Why can't you make them cry and sigh and be scared? And we wanted that full theatrical experience.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about Sabin, because the page I have says Sabin at the top. So some of what I'll reference is what he did. And I met Sabin at ACT in 1988 after we'd come back from the Pros from Dover tour that the three of us did in Europe. And ACT was looking for an improv teacher for the MFA program. And Sabin interviewed me and gave me the job, which was just such a great gift of my life, one of the great gifts of my life. And part of that was working with the students on their Shakespeare projects in my improv class. So part of what I was trying to do at ACT from about 88 to 97 was how do I take all the improv theory and exercise work that had been happening, that we'd been exploring, in our theater sports days, Dan, and offer that to the students so that when they're working on their Shakespeare projects, the work looks more spontaneous and it feels alive and it doesn't feel like they're just reciting language. So having that as an opportunity helped me kind of dig into the challenge of how do we make the language work. And I'm just looking at this page. Sabin brought in themes, which is something that I hadn't explored before at all in any of this stuff. So time, honor, worth, power, love, nature, reality, and fiction as the theme list. So chew on that, improvisers. I mean, you can see, just like throw them up on stage and go, let's do a scene about honor. And immediately you're into it. Dan's physicality and directorial sense about how to stage stuff was really a gift. With the background in fight choreography and just how do you keep it from being two people standing there doing language, looking at each other, which is so deadly. So I agree. We complemented each other well, and his eye and sense of where the stage picture needed to change and when was really vital to making it work in a giant space like we had when we got into the Globe Playhouse, with multiple entrances, not only a trap door. Didn't we have giant doors in the back of the stage too?
Second story, balcony. There was a variety of things that way.
It was a scale model of the Globe in London, and oddly painted, but very functional for our purposes.
One of the things I remember, just in terms of practical little workshop-y things, I remember an exercise you had. We got an emotion and you got an object. You had to do then a 1-minute monologue, toaster and love. My love is like a toaster, and then you spend the minute defining that and or using the language. So you forced us into a Shakespearean.
It pops up before it's done.
Yeah, exactly.
There are two sides, one of rye and one of wheat, and together joined in heat.
And it was actually quite a good thing. And at 1 minute, you'd get close and you'd sense that you were there. But at the same time, you'd be using the language, you'd be using the metaphorical thought process, and so on. It was a really good exercise. And then I remember another one where you would have to be affected by what your partner had just told you in a way that is often Shakespearean. You were late. I'm late because, and you would define it and you'd work within those type things. Anyway, there was a series of those which I copied down, and I actually use it with hit and run workshops and or high school workshops just as a basic thing to get people in those modes. So they're very practical things. And we went through weeks of this before we went on stage. And then, of course, there's the whole business about building a story together.
I don't know if you remember this, Doug, but one of the things Brian and I tried early on, when we first started rehearsing, the plays were over in 15 minutes. It was like we just got through everything very quickly. So we thought, okay, and I think we did this for the first 4 shows or 5 shows, I can't remember. We said the first 3 scenes cannot have anything to do with each other. And that kind of worked. But it also didn't. And we very quickly, for the improvisers who are listening, because so many improv groups build a format so that they have a skeleton to cling to narratively. We threw that out because we had gotten to the point I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but the company had got to the point where we could tell a 2-hour story with an intermission, and we knew enough not to have those rules in place. So we threw out the format thing pretty early on. Veruca agrees. My cat is mewing. Yeah, because we realized, we can find things if we dig deeper, if we spend more time in the moment and not operate at a quote unquote improv speed, but at a play speed where moments had you could see somebody being changed by a line that was being said on stage, as opposed to the sort of mile a minute speed of regular improv. So that really changed everything and gave it a fullness and a weight that was more theatrical and more play-like.
If you take that analogy that gets used in improv of one brick and then the next player adds another brick and then the next player adds another brick, and you're building the story brick by brick, that can send you off in a lot of different directions, and you're not quite sure which brick is the important brick. But what Dan's talking about is that idea, the different analogy of drop the pebble in the water, watch the ripples come out from it, but it's still about that pebble that dropped, and everything circles back to that. And all of your choices are based on those initial offers, so that it's tighter. The weave is tighter. Then you're not trying to incorporate a B story and a C story, and how does that stuff all pull in?
Although often there was incorporation, or there were B stories and C stories, and they actually made it to the end, which is kind of impressive when you think about it. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, like in Midsummer, it all comes back to Hippolyta and Theseus being the first offer in the play. It's their wedding, and the lovers resonate about it. The hard-handed men mechanicals are building the entertainment for it, and the fairies Oberon and Titania are mirroring it and echoing it. So it's still that single idea, but yeah, there are all these other ways that it gets expressed in the world of the story.
I think we ran from April into September, or maybe to the end of September of 99. I think it was something like 5 months. It could have been longer. I'm not sure. I know that I got to be, like I said, Dan had me producing, so I was over to Dan's house all the time and moving stuff back and forth. We were Monday nights at the Globe. I guess they probably had something in regular production on the weekends. I'm sure it did. Thad did. But we got to have Monday nights, and we got pretty good crowds, especially for Monday nights. And I know there was a lot of great stuff. And part of the deal was I got to be in about every third production. Of course, I was delighted with this, but it's kind of a deal. So when I got to be on stage, it was I was all excited. I remember one time, you never know what's going to happen in terms of memorable scenes. We had a lot of them. What I remember one time was I had invited my friend Richard Sakai, who is president of Gracie Films and a childhood friend, and he came that night. And I was very excited. McShane was obviously a heroic character, and Brian had become the villain. We were in a scene in a boat, and I was in the back steering the boat and sort of being the guy who's, got the rudder and everything. And Brian, at one point, he'd been dared to kill somebody or something. He turns around with a knife, and there's McShane sitting there, the hero, and there's me, the guy with the rudder. Brian looks at McShane, and he looks at me, and he's like, and he could see it in his eyes. Sorry, Doug. I fell off the back of the boat. Sakai says to me at the end of the show, "None, you died in the third scene, you idiot. I came all the way to see you." But I was a team player that night.
I remember you getting killed in a few of those, Dougs. That show, that run at the Globe, was seminal in the history of our company in a lot of ways. There were a lot of people who came and saw that show who later became members of the company because they were so blown away by these guys have the hubris to do a 2-hour play. I want to be part of this. But also, there's a show that happened during that run that I use as an example to students all the time about generosity. You being killed in the third act is an act of generosity, what have you. But there's a and I can't remember, Doug, if you were in this show or not, but we had 16 people on stage. So you had to be a generous improviser because there may only be 5 leads, there may only be 2, who knows? But we were doing a show, and Floyd Van Buskirk, who is Rebecca Stockley's teacher. So my teacher was Rebecca Stockley in San Francisco when Brian and I were there. And her teacher was Floyd Van Buskirk, who later joined us down here. So Floyd's kind of the godfather of West Coast improv, non-Chicago West Coast improv, which is a completely different animal. And Floyd was in the show, and he couldn't find a way in. There was no way for him to get in. Whole first act, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, he couldn't get in. Then at the interval, for improvisers who are listening, what we would do is just stand in a circle, and everyone would say who they're playing, what their character's name is to remind everybody else, and if there were any promises to the audience. We would never talk about what was going to happen. We only would talk about what had happened because we didn't want to plan. And I can't remember if we started doing this thing with some of the other shows where we asked the audience to say who's going to start the second half, just to double down on the spontaneity of it. Anyway, the second half starts. Floyd can't get in. Everybody else, the other 15 people had all been on stage, and Floyd had not. But all through the show, there was this thread about the absent king. The king had not been here. And Floyd was pretty grumpy during the interval. I don't know if he thought about this or not, because he was pissed off that he hadn't gotten in, understandably. But in the last 5 minutes of the show, he came through the audience as the king. The rest of us all dropped to one knee, and the audience went ballistic because they knew he had been in the show and they hadn't seen him. And for him to wait that entire time to only come when he was needed, to me, is a terrific act of improvisational patience and grace, because you serve the story. I think that's another thing that we tried to do early on, that Brian and I really tried to do, which was, it's not about you feeding your ham as an individual performer. It's about, what does the story need? And that is a very different, I think it was fairly novel way of approaching improvisational theater at the time, which was, what does the story need? And it's not about, the individuals, but the team, like you were saying earlier.
The serve the story thing, I remember that night really well. I think I was some minion someplace, but then Floyd coming out, bottom of the 9th inning, last batter up, and Floyd clobbered it. It was so great. Yeah, and the serve the story thing, which I think is a Floyd Van Buskirk quote, actually, it's one of those things that I still remember. Brian.
Was just going to say, it's part of the playwright, part of the actor-playwright equation, because the actor, a lot of times your ego is driving you as an actor, and you want to get out there and you want to feel like you're making an impact with the audience. But if you're operating without getting in your head and planning stuff ahead, but really just attending to story as it goes forward, then everybody's got something they can agree on that's important, which is the story that we're telling. That's a unifying thing for us as improvisers, rather than you got your moment, I'm going to get my moment. We're going to look for times when we get on stage and shine, which is the thing that Johnstone would always caution us against. Don't try to do well. Don't look at the show as an opportunity for you to demonstrate how clever and interesting you are. Instead, explore what's the story going to do.
Yeah. And that this was, as a group project, this was great that way. Do you remember how many people were involved with the total? Was it 25 or 30? Because we were 16 per evening.
I have the initial cast list, and we expanded it because this was just the initial postcard was just through May 17th. So April 12th to May 17th. And then the company was Dave Bushnell, Tracy Connor, Robert Covarrubias, Danny Hardigan, me, Catherine Mills, Dan, Morgan Russell, Michelle Spears, Mark Tracy, Chris Vos, and then additional cast, Jeff Branyan, Sandra Kobos, Diane DiRosario, Dean Noble, Doreen Remo, John Rosen, and Doug Nunn. Special guests, Wayne Brady, Tracy Burns, Kerry Coleman, Brad Sherwood, Ali Sweeney, Floyd Van Buskirk.
There you go, man.
Those are the names on the card, but I know we had more people than that. Like you mentioned, McShane.
Yeah. McShane got to be in, I think, 3 or 4 of them. Terrific. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I was going to say Wayne and Brad were in a bunch. Yeah, it was interesting to see how people clicked into the nobility of serving the story. Like people really, I think, felt good about serving the story. It also, I think this type of improv, it does a great job of weeding out assholes because you can't be a driving freak because the audience can see it. If everybody's committed to the story and you have one person who's obviously trying to get their licks in selfishly, it clangs. It's definitely something different. And I think that was kind of the magic of those shows, and the magic of all the unscripted shows since then is watching people serve the story together and they create the story together.
Doing the parody version of it and going for the jokes and all the stuff that we learned doing short form Shakespeare scenes, performing at festivals or touring, that stuff starts to fade away and peel away. The glory of doing a long run like this and committing to a cast in a space every week doing the same show and really treating it like a piece of theater in that way is like a play. It starts to deepen and develop, and people start doing richer work and they get bored with their tricks. By show 7, I'm probably bored with myself on stage and starting to do, paying attention to what's going on around me more and looking for something new.
Yeah. I have a question for both of you because in a lot of ways, I can't remember if one or the other of you was called the director, but you were effectively co-directors in my mind. So here you are each Monday night, you're improvising, you're being part of the team. You're, I've got the role tonight. I'm the sidekick, or I'm, the sneaky backstage guy, or whatever it happens to be. Then at a certain point, you're also the director. So you're thinking to yourself, hey, it's 4 scenes in, and it's not obvious here who the antagonist is or whatever. What was it like actually in your minds as improv directors? What was it like for you to be on the side thinking? What's going through your minds?
Well, there's a conversation has been going since then. We have talked, and Brian and I were co-directors, and we've co-directed a lot of things together, I think, very well. We used to give notes to the cast for shows that we were in, which some people found frustrating because they're like, how can you wear both hats in the show? And I think speaking for myself, I found it very, very easy to do that because I was keenly aware of the show as an improviser first, but also secondarily in the back of my head as the director. And the thing that you needed to remember is you can't really direct from within the show. Occasionally, I will admit, I will cop to this, that if we had a less experienced person and it was obvious that their character might need to do something, I might, sidle up to them backstage and go, hey, you need to have a scene with such and such. But very rarely did I do that. What I tried to do more often than not is, and I'm sure Brian has different methodologies, but I would try to do it within the scene, endowing somebody. That's the wonderful thing about this is you can give gifts on stage. And as long as you're not manipulating people, I think that's the line is you don't want to manipulate the story or the people. You want to emphasize or what's the word I'm looking for? You want to amplify whatever the seed is that's there, because we all know, we really want him to confess his love to yada yada. So if you could help, and the parlance is, if you could pimp the person by endowing them with did you see Bianca looking at you? Her eyes do stare deep into your soul. If you could do that in a way to help theatricalize, then you would do it. The thing that you really needed to take your director hat off for the show and just be an improviser, because otherwise you start looking at things from the standpoint of what's going wrong rather than what's going right. I think if you're an improviser, you're on the, what's good now? Let's make that happen.
Well said, Dan. Yeah, I think that is an ongoing conversation because it's a challenge. Everybody sees things they want to change in a show while it's happening, or a direction that they think that would help the show. If it went in this direction, this would be helpful, because we're all creating the story together. It's dangerous because anyone could direct at any point or start to give notes or start to, manipulate the show, like you said. So part of what Dan and I needed to do was model good behavior on stage and not be giving notes. I mean, that was something I learned in doing Pole Playhouse in San Francisco, was giving notes to the actors during the show. It was one of my worst moments as a director. And it didn't last long once I saw how poorly that worked. Well, I will say that a couple of ways that the show can be shaped from within that I was paying attention to was, have we had any verse? Have we had rhyming couplets? Is it mostly been prose? How could those offers be made so it has that variety that Shakespeare has written into his plays? And the other thing is scene length. Scenes have gone on a lot. How can I go out and do a short scene, do 4 lines, and get off stage? Scene length and whatever the verse prose ratio was. Those were 2 things that I looked at.
We eventually said, look for ways to get off. Look for ways to leave the stage, because it got very comfortable. You could wax poetic for a long time. And I think that's the first time we really started talking about theatrical beats. If you are still talking about the same thing that you were talking about at the beginning of the scene, 3-4 minutes in, you're in the tumble dryer of improv, and you are shrinking the sweater of the story. You need to get off stage.
It's already dry. Now you're just burning it.
It's dried. It's now too small for anyone to wear. So occasionally what would happen is someone would enter, and I think beginning improvisers do this a lot, which is that they see somebody chewing through the same beat and they just come on because they know something needs to happen. But then the people on stage still go through that. So what everybody began to learn is, our work is done here. We can leave. Or Shakespeare does such a great job of the emotional pitch at the end of a scene, literally throwing the actors off, exit chased by bear, so we want to get to those moments. So we change the dynamic of, go to those moments, try and find those moments, rather than the sort of pithy improv, we're going to just be funny and in front of the audience. I mean, it does become masturbatory at some point, and you need to get back to the story.
Yeah. If you've got the inspiration happening at the moment, if you're touched in that moment to create some poetry that has some beauty in it and some meaning in it, then yeah, you can hold that stage and you can go deep and go into it. But if you're just trying to find it while you're out there and the audience is watching you struggle, that's painful for everybody. So you have to be attentive to that stuff. Another tool that Shakespeare gives us too is entrance announcements. So if I'm out there in a scene with Dan and we know that this other character really needs to get back on stage and do something, or we have a relationship with them, we can go, look, Hortensio comes. He will now bring us the news from court we have anticipated.
And then Doug goes on stage and you guys are, no, just kidding.
The other Hortensio.
Hortensio.
Yeah. I think we're gonna end up closing here soon, just because I want to go the long form as well. I want to do a whole other show, and maybe you guys could think of a few other people to invite for that. So, to do an improv theater type show, if that's cool with you. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to ask you one other question. I know you've done all these times with improv theater, Brian, Pole Playhouse, etc. You guys have done all kinds of long form and or improv unscripted styles. What are some of your favorites for you to play? I know you've both killed at Jane Austen. I've seen a lot of those shows. I love them. Dan and Brian, tell us some of your favorite styles to improvise in a full-length play.
Well, I've had so much fun with Dan on stage in a number of different arenas, and getting to do Jane Austen, where we've gotten to play all of the great comic archetypes that she lays out for you. That's a really fun world to play in, and it's sweet, and it ends up nicely. I love doing musicals. I love doing musicals because it's always going to end well, even if the first half you were spiraling around. As long as the plane lands with a big ta-da, then it's okay. But man, Dan, I've had such fun doing Dickens with you. That holds up for me as a singular long form show because everybody can narrate in it. The way that you and I developed that from the or a C version of Nicholas Nickleby, the gift of anybody being able to just start doing prose or move the story forward and then drop back into a character. I love doing improvised Dickens.
Yeah, I would really love to do that show again. It's been a while. It's funny because some of my best, and I'm getting a little teary, Bri. Some of my favorite moments on stage have been with you, and in Shakespeare specifically, but also Chekhov. As much as I love Jane Austen and
go man, go.
As much as I love Jane Austen and getting to fall in love with my wife 4 or 5 times a week on stage, if she's the love interest of mine, I really, really like Chekhov in a way that is, for me as an actor, is pretty profound, because it's all, I have the same feelings when we improvise Chekhov as I do when I do text work. And I don't know if that's true in some of the other stuff. Maybe with Tennessee Williams, it's true a little bit, but there's moments on stage, because it's so calm, even when it's tumultuous, there's a feeling of calm because you're improvising a play with your friends, and you can leave at any time and everything you do is going to be fine, because unlike Jane Austen, where there's an arc and you have to get to the A couple coming together at the end, and Chekhov, sometimes it's exactly the same at the end as it was in the beginning. And what we've seen is how humans are. I was teaching in Seattle recently, and I got to show them clips of our shows, because normally I'm teaching in a vacuum. People haven't seen improv theater, so they don't know what it is to have a production with sets and props and sound design and what have you. Relating it without seeing it is kind of difficult. But I showed a scene from the Chekhov we did it upstairs at the Pasadena Playhouse, Bri, where you are this kind of crazy writer, I think, and I'm the doctor who's been cheating with your wife. Amy Kidd was playing your wife, I think, and she was pregnant again by me, not you. You were having a tantrum, and I said, if you're having a tantrum, you're going to have a heart attack. And you're like, you are not my doctor. You are not my doctor. And I said, well, you need to calm down. He goes, you're not my doctor, and if I die, then you really won't be my doctor, or something along those lines, which was fantastic. And you exit in a screaming huff. And Patty Wortham goes, that is my son. That is the fruit of my loins. That is the fire that is my boy, and follows you out. And it was just such a great, because I think people think of Chekhov as being still. I think people think of Chekhov as still. And that scene is just like, it's a circus Ferris wheel that is unhinged and is rolling through the town. Yeah, and right. I just so enjoy those moments on stage of that level of fire and relation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It brings us a full circle, at least for this time. We've been introduced here to Shakespeare Unscripted by Dan O'Connor and Brian Lohmann. And it also reminds us that we have a whole other episode to be done for SnapSessions about their work with improv theater, pulp playhouse, and a variety of other long forms that they've done. That's going to be for future reference. But I want to thank Dan O'Connor and Brian Lohmann for giving us a chance to talk about Shakespeare Unscripted, which premiered in 1999 at the Globe Theater in West Hollywood, and we ran for 5 or 6 months, as I recall.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm sorry we didn't get to kill you today, but you made it through the whole interview.
Yeah. I think out of the, we probably did, 6 months, we probably did 24 shows, say. I probably played in 8 or 9 of them, and I was probably killed in about half of those shows. So there you go.
Yeah.
And, it continued to have a glorious life. I have really fond memories of doing Shakespeare Unscripted at the Ukiah Playhouse with you guys, with Kate Herbert out from Australia as a special guest, and Doug chasing butterflies around the stage is one of the kind of magical images of being on stage with Doug that I have from that genre.
Well, I have a lot of magical images of being with you guys over many years now. So I look forward to putting this out for SnapSessions. And I also look forward to talking in more detail about improv theater, pulp playhouse, and the like.
Whenever you like, Doug. Whenever you like.
Thanks for listening to Snap Sessions. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to us on Patreon or buy me a coffee. We depend on the support of listeners like you.
Evan Mills is an environmentalist who worked for many years for Lawrence Labs at the University of California at Berkeley. During his tenure, he participated in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, co-winners of the Nobel Peace Prize along with former Vice President Al Gore in 2007 for their work pointing out the dangers of climate change. We interviewed Evan about 3 years ago to investigate his work as an environmental scientist. Now, Evan is investigating a supposedly green industry, indoor marijuana farming, in his new guise as a muckraking journalist. And so now, our second interview with Evan Mills. We've got Evan Mills back on Snap Sessions. Evan was one of our big interview subjects back, I believe it's episode 29 or so, that we had Evan on. Evan is a lifelong environmental scientist. He has also been working in recent years on the ethics of marijuana growing, especially indoor growing. There's a long amount of information here, and Evan has been on the forefront of what I think of as marijuana muckraking. And welcome, Evan, back to Snap Sessions.
Thank you. I've always liked M&Ms. So let's go, and thanks, Doug, for chatting with me again.
Yeah. We've talked about the history. I'll just give some basic background. California legalized medical marijuana back in 1996, and then recreational marijuana in 2016, after years of witnessing an expanding marijuana industry. Initially, hippy-dippy lore, everyone grew it outdoors. It was the proverbial weed. Partly because of its illegal status, a lot of this moved indoors. People were hiding it. And then there develops a certain number of habits that come with growing indoors. You first wrote about the carbon footprint of indoor cannabis cultivation back in 2011-12, and you included some brilliant graphics. I will point people out to this when we put this up. What pushed you in this direction of wanting to talk about indoor cannabis?
You know, several things. As a person working on energy problems writ large, locally, nationally, globally, all forms of energy, all sectors, such a rich environment, you know, intellectually, and so many different kinds of problems. And I think over the years, I kind of became the person who was the most interested in issues and things happening around what you might call the edges of the issue. You know, a lot of people rightfully work on, you know, efficient heating and cooling, or efficient appliances, or efficient lighting and efficient cars, and that's all good and important. But there's so many other kind of edge cases that are more niche uses of energy, but are important sources of pollution and energy use, and that have different solutions to them. So it's kind of that, my curiosity, always looking for, well, what aren't people looking at or studying? And then I moved to Mendocino about 15 years ago, and being in the local nursery, garden shop, one day buying rose fertilizer, I look behind the counter and there's a whole row of 1,000-watt light bulbs. You know, these light bulbs are like little electric heaters, literally, like a little portable electric heater you'd have under your desk is 1,000 watts. And so I start pulling on the thread, and that got me engaged. And then it was obviously an important part of the local economy, the local environmental footprint. And so I studied the energy use for that reason. On top of that all, it was just so fascinating. Something just to understand. I didn't know it was a problem. I was curious, like, wow, 1,000 watts here, 1,000 watts there, so many square feet, so many, like, what is the scale of this? Just to scope it. And that was my first exercise. It was just, is this big? Is it small? Is it important? Is it not important? And so it was the curiosity. And then you get into it, and it's like so different from any other energy problem because of the technology process that's being done. Like, energy use in the steel industry is different than energy use in the textile industry. It's different than energy use in a home. And they all have their own intellectual challenges. But one thing that was interesting here is that it's botany together with energy and the service that you get out of it. Like we always say, an efficient refrigerator, the service is cold beer. So how do we use less energy to get cold beer? And that's the way you should think about it, not some abstract engineering number, because it's what we need is the cold beer. We don't need the energy that the refrigerator uses. So how can we use less energy to keep our beer cold? With cannabis, of course, it's more complex. It's a plant product with certain properties. So how much energy is used per unit of value in that industry, and how do we use less of it without torpedoing the industry? And they can be decoupled, which is very important because people think of energy use as a necessary evil to get something, whether it's from point A to B or to get the cold beer or to get the cannabis flower. But we know, since the middle 70s, those things decoupled and we were able to use less energy and still have quality of life. And so this is a microcosm of that.
You've worked for years for Lawrence Labs in Berkeley. You're an energy expert within the school. You've also evolved off in different directions. Not only have you looked at indoor cannabis, you've also looked at the energy use of video gaming and stuff like that. So you've taken on these so-called peripheral issues.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to me because this is actually a huge energy user. This is one of the ones I first read, I think back in 2011. This is a quote from your article. The emergent industry of indoor cannabis production, legal in some jurisdictions and illicit in others, utilizes highly energy-intensive processes to control environmental conditions during cultivation. This article estimates the energy consumption for this practice in the United States at 1% of national electricity use, or $6 billion per year. This is back in 2011.
$6 billion, yeah.
$6 billion, yeah, excuse me. One average kilogram of final product is associated with 4,600 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, or that of 3 million average U.S. cars when aggregated across national production. So how did you come upon these comparisons?
My mentor when I was young and coming up, he was the last graduate student of Enrico Fermi, the famous physicist.
Oh, yes, wow.
And Fermi was very famous kind of in the popular culture for explaining science to lay people through analogies or equivalencies. Mm-hmm. In a whole different world than what you and I are talking about here today. But my mentor, Art Rosenfeld, brought that into the energy sphere in the early 70s when he and many other physicists retreaded themselves to look at energy issues. And so he was, if not the first, one of the very first who would talk about, well, how many cars is this equal to? This factory or this activity in the culture. You see that now again and again in the media and in government communications about energy. This is like 1 million cars, or this is like so-and-so. And so that was part of my training, was to look for ways to put things in context that mean something to not just everyday people, but also to decision makers. It's not hard to do, right? Like if you have some exotic energy using activity that uses 1,000 barrels of oil a day, so many refrigerators use 1 barrel a day, then that activity is like 1,000 refrigerators. The arithmetic's very simple. You just have to kind of conceptualize, well, what do we want to compare this to? And like with cannabis, one of these that's so compelling is that a typical cannabis plant grown indoors uses as much energy as there is in 70 gallons of oil.
Wow.
So just to think of a 6-foot-tall cannabis plant laden with really nice bud, good plant that's been grown indoors. This is factory farming, back up half a step. This is industrialized factory farming, indoor agriculture. We're talking about no windows, no daylight, intense environmental control. We're not talking about outdoor cultivation here. And there are, of course, these two threads of the industry maybe we'll come back to, but they're very, very, very fundamentally different in their environmental footprint. And all of this work that I've done is around indoor, because again, it was the fringe within the cannabis environment conversation, which had focused almost exclusively on important things like toxicities in the food chain, or outdoor diesel generators, or damming creeks, or denuding landscapes, or causing erosion, leaving solid waste, all those things that are very important. That's a different basket of environmental problems than the energy use. And indoor cultivation is, of course, very out of sight and out of mind. But today it's 60% of cannabis produced nationally by weight, and it's ostensibly the highest grade cannabis, which is a bit of a myth. But at any rate, it's become very significant. A typical grow table, like a 4x4 grow table, this is when we were looking originally at smaller residential grow house scale of cultivation. One 4x4 foot grow table farmed, if you will, intensively in a house can use as much energy per year as the entire house. Or it can double that house's energy and carbon spend. And so that was an analogy. Like you said, you can convert this to cars, or in California, it was like 1 million houses. So the indoor cannabis production with electricity in California. So those are some of the equivalencies. The method is usually pretty simple in a math sense. It's more thinking about what's of interest to compare.
This is an offshoot here, but one of my favorite things, and I'm going to have to make this graphics visible for our SnapSessions listeners,
Sure.
is this was back in 2011-12. There's a big graphics piece about all the different components of growing indoors, everything from grow lights, as you mentioned, to fans, to temperature control, to a variety of other things that are all used, hydroponic gardening additives, etc. This is a huge chart, and the amount of components necessary to do this is rather significant. I grow a few plants every year. I've been doing this for years. I just, start some seeds. I plant them in some soil, potting soil. I transfer the potting soil to a bigger pot at a certain time. I add fish emulsion, maybe some blood meal and bone meal, and I'm off to the races. And it is a weed, and it grows like crazy in California, so it's quite easy to grow a plant. Over time, if it's male, I pull it. If it's female, I let it grow, because then you get big flowers. And so it's very simple. But to read about the indoor growing, I was fairly unaware of it. And you kind of educated me about this. I've since found out that a lot of people are doing it.
What you said is well taken. On the other hand, or to add some nuance to it, outdoor ditchweed, which I'm not accusing you of growing, but that it's there is, like with anything, like creating a fine wine is harder than creating a bathtub wine. There's a lot of skill and there's a lot of knowledge botanically, obviously here, and then when you're indoors, as a tremendous amount of engineering challenges, because humidity is your enemy and excess temperature it's insufficient temperature is your enemy, over or under irrigation, other pests and things. And then, of course, the market is very discerning about potency, about cannabinoid profiles. And so to produce a high-quality cannabis that also passes mandatory laboratory testing for chemical residuals is not for the faint of heart. And, there's a lot of skill. One of the arguments for indoor is that you can only produce good cannabis indoors. I beg to differ with that, and I've written extensively about that, and there's quite a literature actually scientifically showing that you can get unbelievable cannabinoid profiles, better cannabinoid profiles in daylight, because you've got a very limited spectrum with electric light. People are now getting in the low to mid 20% THC with, again, skillful outdoor cultivation, and as you probably know, the most potent indoor cultivation is cannabis can go up into the low mid 30% of THC. But back when we were kids, strong cannabis was 3% THC, 4%, 5%. Begs the question about how potent is potent enough.
And how high do you need to be? That's another question. That's a basic question.
Well, this is another interview. How high and how fast? It's like, seriously, like 2 tokes of 15% equals 1 toke of 30%. And actually, there's medical literature also showing, there's a lot of medical downside of cannabis. I'm not a cannabis hater, but it's certainly not talked about in the popular media and in most circles. There are real questions that the neuroscience community now is raising about the degree of potency of the product, and that 2 tokes of 15% can be healthier than 1 toke of 30, and I don't completely understand the physiology of that. We're in a culture that just wants more and more of everything all the time, and stronger everything, and it's not necessarily the case here.
That brings me back to speaking of how high do you need to be? Back in 2016, so this is 5 years on from your original muckraking piece, you had a back and forth with the editors of High Times, and you said the following paragraph, and I'd like you to fill us in perhaps on your back and forth. Some broader perspective is important. Without debating what portion of production goes to medical versus recreational use, the sad fact is that the U.S. uses twice as much electricity and spends 6 times more money on it for indoor cannabis than for all other pharmaceuticals combined. In any case, as noted above, both need to be addressed, not just a relatively large one. Both of these questions. So I'm just curious about this back and forth with High Times.
Yeah, they were clearly smoking something. It was 5 years in, and that in itself, it's like virtually no one attacked the work that I did in an intellectual sense. It was definitely presented, this is back more than a decade ago, being the first word, not the last word, just let's start looking at this and doing the Enrico Fermi, let's ballpark what we've got here. Basically, they wrote a critique out of nowhere, didn't consult me to do an interview or anything. It was sad. I'm all for debate and digging into things and getting better and getting sharper and correcting things and so on. But it wasn't in any kind of a spirit of insight. It was more really in the tone of denialism, of misdirection, of putting up red herrings and kind of trying to direct the audience away from the real question there. There was no fact checking. They compared the energy use I estimated for cannabis nationally to the internet or to IT. They used some vague name, but I think it meant the internet. And they said the internet uses this much and cannabis only uses this little bit. So the number they used for the internet was twice the entire electricity use of the whole country. They were just out of their depth And I wouldn't expect High Times to be energy analysts, but fact check it, talk to somebody, do some simple arithmetic, look up how much electricity does the US use. So there were problems like that. And there were things like, well, a hamburger uses more energy, or it's like, why are you singling us out as an industry? When in fact, it's the opposite that's true. Every industry has been looked at for its energy and environmental impacts for decades.
Sure.
You could argue that the oil industry is using, I'm not defending the oil industry, but doing more to manage its energy use than the cannabis industry, because being in the black market and being highly proprietary and secretive and sole proprietors, so to speak, there's not a lot of knowledge sharing, or it's folk knowledge, and it's not really, let's gather the data, let's graph it up, let's see what best practices are, what are worst practices, what are the technologies. And so there was this kind of, no, you're not being singled out, actually. It's more like catching up with everybody else.
Right.
And it's an okay conversation. It's not making anyone wrong. It's just you can't manage what you don't measure, the cliche. And so let's measure and understand and manage. So there were just errors of fact. There were emphasis on tiny points at the expense of the overall point, and lots of technical things that we won't go into about fans and how much fans use and so on. But I wrote a 2,000-word commentary on their article. They published a little bit of it, and I titled it, I was proud of this title, A Low Point for High Times, which I think it really was. I mean, with any industry, whether it's car manufacturer or owner of real estate or agricultural interest or whatever, regulation is the last resort. Ideally, industries will police themselves, they'll raise their game, they'll put their best foot forward. Here's a media entity that's in a position to take the higher ground and say, we could do better, and here's how, and not apologize and not misdirect. So that was the unfortunate part of the experience, and they didn't have any response to what I wrote, and it just sat there, and it's fine. It's a lone voice of dissent that really wasn't well informed. I don't think it had any impact. It was just a lost opportunity for them.
I think it would have been interesting if they had gone with you and talked more about it. Now, of course, you followed along. 2021, you wrote an article for Slate, and I think it's great that you've got this relationship with Slate now, which is something I read too. In order to make cannabis green, we need to grow it outdoors, is the name of the article. And here's a nice quote from that one. Once the domain of barefoot gardeners, millions of pounds of cannabis, the nation's highest value cash crop, I did not know that.
Bigger than corn.
Yeah, are now produced each year in Walmart-sized, windowless, energy-intensive factory farms. More than 40% of producers grow exclusively indoors. To some extent, this is a holdover from the stealthy black market days, but it also provides farmers shelter from some of nature's hazards, allows 5 or more harvests each year, I didn't know that either, and is easier to mechanize in the name of a more uniform and predictable product. Investors seem to love the glitzy multi-million-dollar ventures more than tractors, compost, and blue sky. Do you think the indoor industry of marijuana growing is now too firmly grounded to be uprooted?
Well, there's plenty of inertia, enormous investment. I mean, it can cost $100 million to build one giant cannabis warehouse.
Wow.
There are billions and billions and billions of dollars invested. And so, like with any industry, there's been a commitment. So there's inertia. I see glimmers of hope for newcomers, because there are newcomers all the time. They don't have that investment. They're not locked in. And so I think newcomers to the industry are thinking twice and looking at how do we manage the energy. I wrote another piece about environment, social, and governance, so-called ESG investing, and how this industry can be looked at by financial companies and stock rating companies through that lens. And again, every industry is looked at through those lenses now, and Apple and Nike, and they all have ratings for ESG. And cannabis, because there are lots of traded companies now in the stock market, they have C and D ratings on ESG. And I did my own look at that. But at any rate, investors are vulnerable, because they're not really aware, they can't be expected to be, and certainly aren't energy and environmentally literate in a technical sense. And so I think a lot of money is being lost. There is kind of a boom and bust, specter of boom and bust facing this industry, and companies are going bankrupt. I mean, there are a lot of bankruptcies, there's a lot of empty real estate, and I'm not hanging that all on the energy bills, but the energy bills are extremely high. 20, 30, 40% of wholesale revenue is energy spend.
Yeah.
Goes back out the door as energy. And you take at the other end extreme, like let's say you own an office building, 1% of the value generated, the revenue generated by the activities in that office building is energy. Other sectors of the economy are much less energy sensitive in terms of their profitability. But here's an industry where there's more energy used per unit weight to grow cannabis than to make aluminum and another number of other metals. And so it's very energy intensive, which is okay. It's not It's like, okay, but just is what it is. You feel it from just a cash flow. We're not talking about environment now, just cash flow. And then there's huge capital. Like I said, these tens of millions of dollars. These are air conditioning systems that are like what you put in a data center. I mean, these are very sophisticated, very costly, very capital intensive, millions and millions and millions of dollars of light fixtures, millions and millions of dollars of dehumidification, water recovery. There's a lot of processes going on. Long answer to your question, I think, there's a lot of inertia, but there are pressures, market forces, let's say, that might be pushing the industry to rethink some of this.
Yeah. And, this brings us to your most recent article, which is really quite an interesting one. This is also in Slate. Came out just a few weeks ago. It's called Environmental Justice Up in Smoke. You did a lot of research here in Oakland, a.k.a. Oaksterdam, which is sort of a dope growing capital here in Northern California. And a lot of stuff is grown industrial scale in warehouses in Oakland. And this piece, Up in Smoke, you educate the audience about that. You did a lot of on-the-ground reporting and visiting a lot of these warehouses. Oakland has an apparent Oakland Green Zone. And tell us about the Green Zone, income, race, environmental burdens of these parts of Oakland. I used to live on 82nd Avenue and East 14th Street when I was a kid. That area...
Were you growing pot in second grade?
No.
Okay. Just checking.
I hadn't a clue. Talk to us a little bit about the Oakland Green Zone and what's going on there.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
It is, and it was a real sleeper for a lot of people. So first of all, the Green Zone. So Oakland, of course, is part of the cannabis legalization movement that traces back a quarter of a century, as you mentioned at the top. It's like any city who has city planning, does zoning and designates certain parts of cities for certain activities. And so for cannabis, they wanted a cannabis industry to flourish and create jobs and create tax revenues, but they didn't want it everywhere. And so they created a thing called the Green Zone. It's about 10 miles long, runs from like Alameda Island down towards the airport. Okay. And that's a zone where indoor cannabis industrial factory farms can be permitted. And so the city designated the area and then issues permits, and then those developers have to go to the state and get a license. And so once the city permit and the state license, you can go into business and you can produce. So that's the Green Zone. Also, if you look at demographic maps, what you will notice is that the Green Zone is very coincident, very overlapping with the most non-white parts of Oakland, the poorest parts of Oakland, and the most already environmentally overburdened is the term of art, environmentally overburdened. So it's remarkable, and I can share that chart with you, and it's very compelling. And this is not unusual, and it's not unique for cannabis, that industrial activity happens in these areas where marginalized people are living. It's an old story. But here and now it's happening with cannabis. And it wouldn't be a problem if cannabis wasn't an environmental problem. So part B. In about 2017, some out-of-state investors came in. And there are 200 cannabis grows now in the Green Zone in Oakland. These are indoor, intensively farmed, energy-intensive facilities. They've all been licensed and permitted. We don't know how many illegal ones there are. Because they're easy to have illegally because there's no windows and there are telltale signs. But even though it's legal in California, 80% of the cannabis produced in California today is illicit market. And that's a whole separate conversation. Structural problems, poor execution of legalization, many factors, organized crime, a lot of different factors, but there's still a lot of illicit cultivation indoors and outdoors. So anyway, back in 2017, investors from out of state came in. They borrowed $50 million from the bank, bought 2 enormous warehouses in downtown Oakland. By enormous, I mean about 5 acres of footprint under roof. And they converted that to cannabis cultivation as like an industrial park. So they began to convert it, and then they leased out the spaces to up to 13 growers who then would finish building out their spaces and run their cultivation businesses. And each would have ideally its own permitting. So they were the landlord, the owner, the developer, expressly for cannabis. They brought growers in, signed leases. The growers immediately expanded the canopy to the point that they blew out PG&E transformers, and they exceeded the capacity of the grid, which was substantial, into this building. I think there were 3,000 amps or something into this building, maybe more. And they caused up to 4 different power outages over time, and a PCB leaking transformer as well, which is a highly toxic transformer fluid that's been outlawed long ago, but they're still in transformers. Sure. And we don't know cause and effect for sure, but to me it's very likely that that transformer was overheated and was leaking because of this. So anyway, what happened was, instead of stopping and saying, okay, we need to go work with PG&E and get our service upgraded, which is no small thing, but it's like, hey, if you want to have this activity, you've got to have power. Instead, they leased and brought in, at the peak, 12 gigantic diesel generators. We're talking about semi-tractor trailer size generators. The biggest were like 50 feet long. And these generators were like 500,000 watts to 2 million watts in size. And these trailers were coming and going and coming and going. According to the tenants, 6 hours a day, there were diesel trucks, fuel trucks refueling these generators because they can only hold so much fuel. They're running 24 hours a day at peak output a lot of the time. So in one of these buildings on the second floor was this wonderful, wonderful place called the Cannery Collective. One of the buildings was called the Cannery, the other was called the Tinnery. And these were old 1930s. One's an Art Deco. These are both historic buildings, historic factories in downtown Oakland. And this remarkable man named Arthur Monroe was an African-American abstract expressionist painter in the 1950s. 60s. And he was really a trendsetter in this art form. And he moved into the Cannery in 1975 and started an artist collective there. And they kind of settled the second floor of this building, got approvals from the city, built it out over time to be earthquake safe and all that. And there were 30 people living there in, I think, 10 different artist lofts. And he started the artist loft movement in Oakland. He's like, hey, they can do this in New York. Let's do this in Oakland. So sorry for being long-winded, but this is interesting.
This was important to get on. This is also part of what you described a moment ago, the Green Sage incident, right?
Yeah, so Green Sage is
please continue with Mr. Monroe.
Sure, so I'll try to be concise. So Green Sage was the out-of-state investor from Colorado who swooped in and started this project. Monroe, here comes Monroe, creates this amazing collective. They're going along. Then comes in Green Sage on the ground floor. So there are people living above this. And these generators are running 24 hours a day. There are black soot stains on the walls. There are odors, dangerous odors. We can talk about that in a minute, some of the other environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation. Anyway, these people were suffering. And the diesel, just to give you a sense, like the amount of energy that was going into these generators was up to 12,000 gallons a day of diesel fuel being burned at the peak. It's enough power to run 9,000 California houses, all electric houses, under the feet of 30 people. Yeah. And so there was a lot of impact, and there are a number of environmental justice issues. There's certainly local air pollution. The diesel generator is the exception, not the rule. Mm-hmm. But here it was, and it ran for 2 years. I have a timeline. There's a whole string of local, regional, and state level violations, red tagging, lawsuits, cease and desist orders. The generators were not licensed. So these generators were not legal. A lot of the construction was not legal. The electrical work that they were doing was not legal. Many of these growers were not licensed or permitted. You have all these people being impacted and this very kind of reckless behavior and not doing the right thing. So there are other issues with environmental justice and cannabis. I mean, there's a notion of climate justice. Sure. So that's a global issue. The climate change impacts on the people living upstairs are not any worse than the climate change impacts of people living in Zimbabwe. But there's a climate justice issue. There's a local air pollution issue because you have the diesel exhaust. You have all these delivery trucks that are diesel. And then in addition to that, there's something that most people don't know about. You know, it's cool to talk about, hey, these groovy terps in this weed, really nice, terps. Well, terps are volatile organic compounds, which are
the VOCs.
Or VOCs, yeah. And there are 150 of them just in cannabis, and there are thousands and thousands of them in the world, and they come out of your gas pump, and they come out of a lot of industrial processes, and each terpene has a different profile and different public health issues. But the terpenes from cannabis have mostly not been studied from a public health standpoint. Some of them are known to create a respiratory injury to laboratory animals, things like that. They're some of the ones from cannabis. The levels inside the grow for the workers, who are, by the way, dominantly non-white and dominantly low paid, terpene levels are up to many thousands, even tens of thousands of times higher than outdoor terpene levels. There are natural terpenes and there are industrial terpenes. Cities have a lot of industrial terpenes. So the workers are exposed. The California OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety Administration, has identified 23 worker health and safety risks associated with cannabis production. They're chemical, biological, and mechanical. Includes things like repetitive strain injury, eye strain, but also physiological hazards. There's an environmental justice issue for the workers, and there's mold. The workers are breathing mold, and the carbon dioxide, so you mentioned briefly, I think at the top, carbon dioxide is injected into cannabis grows to speed plant growth.
Plants breathe CO2, we breathe oxygen.
Yeah, and the coal industry used to tell us in the 80s that burning fossil fuel was greening the earth. And it was actually accelerating plant growth and pollen production and other things. So anyway, we've now discovered that CO2 levels inside a growing environment, multiple adverse cognitive impacts on human beings. So it's a worker issue, and then outside, the terpenes have been measured. Most of the work's been done in Denver, which is one of the other big green zones in the United States. Those up to a mile away from the cannabis grows, the terpene levels, the VOC levels are above the background outdoor levels. And within the neighborhood of the grows, they're 4 to 8 times higher than the background of Denver, which itself is like 10 times the background of a natural rural area. Solid waste, this industry produces vast amounts. The estimate I've seen is 150 million tons per year of solid waste. It's all kinds of forms, Again, there's literature like the solid waste dumps are differentially impacting marginalized people, because that's where they're located. And so you have like that environmental justice issue. There's just a lot of different impacts, noise pollution, light pollution, again, all the vehicle traffic.
Diesel generators you mentioned, there's a lot of noise pollution there. Yeah.
I mean, you can't turn them off.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you turn that generator, and in fact, that's one of the arguments the growers made, that if you shut us down, we're going to lose millions of dollars of plants and have to fire all these people. Because within 24 hours, they start molding. They have to run all the time.
That level of blackmail again reappearing. It's interesting. We can go back 150 years and talk about robber barons in the railroad industries of the late 19th century, and we see this repetitive thing. Ostensibly something that was a classic green industry. Yeah. It wasn't even an industry, it was just a green thing to do. It has been transformed over time. And that's why I bring up the muckraking thing. And I like that. That to me is a big compliment, that you're doing muckraking, because you're reporting on something that had been underreported or not reported at all. You're making it part of discourse, which is important. So I think on that level, it's really important. I wanted to ask you one final question about outdoor growing, but please go ahead.
To zero in on what you were just saying, kind of the point of the slate piece and the point that compels the need to just think this through and look at environmental justice in cannabis is that not only is it an unexpected industry to be creating problems, because of the social history and the values. And cannabis is associated with so many great things in our culture and thinking and art and environmental protection. It's guilt by association in a good way. And so it's particularly odd that it is happening here. But even more specifically, a lot of the argumentation now that's correct, argumentation, but it's incomplete, for cannabis development and things like the green zone is making up for the war on drugs. So it's the social equity issue. Let's employ marginalized people. Let's bring economic development to marginalized neighborhoods. Let's make amends for these historic, disproportionately adverse impacts on people of color and people of lower income and so on. So that all sounds great. And California has an cannabis equity program, and they give priority licensing and permit fee discounts and, a number of things to try to help these formerly discriminated against parties to get a leg up in this industry and share in the wealth. So now, the communities that we're helping, rightfully so, with the public policy for social equity are, I don't know if inadvertently is too generous, but are consequentially, ironically, particularly adversely impacting those same populations, right? And that's the piece that is so, crazy making, and that policymakers really need to step back and look more holistically at what they're doing. And the worst place to do indoor cultivation is in cities, because the most people are there, the highest population density, and because of zoning, they are in these marginalized areas. So the last place you want to do indoor cultivation is in a city, because if you're in the countryside and you're emitting these VOCs, or you have light pollution or something, there's still people living, but the public health impacts are so vastly lower. Oakland's got 1 million people or whatever. It's so wrong in so many different ways.
Well, the last thing I wanted to check, of course, there are problems with outdoor growing, especially in mass with a large farm scale. Outdoor outlaw grows in the Northern California counties for years have been problematic. People bring in huge amounts of inorganic fertilizer. They're washed downstream. There's erosion. There's huge amounts of hosing and wire, etc., that's left. People just don't clean up after themselves. All of these things are bad as part of the outdoor growing thing. But my question, if people minded their business, the outdoor growing in and of itself is much healthier than indoor growing, energy-wise at least. What would you say about that?
Absolutely, and I'm not opposing or dismissing the cannabis industry wall to wall. It's this indoor-outdoor distinction, and Outdoor cultivation. I'm also a farmer. I have an organic garden at home, very small but very intensive. It's a bio-intensive method.
It's a fun place to visit, by the way.
We do serious composting and cover cropping to harvest nitrogen from the air and carbon from the air, and very, very little fertilizer goes into it. And we have very high yields from the garden of dozens of different crops that I grow. And so it's an agricultural question. One of the problems with all of this, one of the kind of sleights of hand, is that indoor cultivation is, for what it is, very optimized. There's been decades and billions of dollars to computer control the irrigation, to get the canopy as dense as possible, to get, as like you were saying, as many harvests per year, all of that, control quality. Outdoor cultivation is broadly not optimized. I mean, there are great growers and there's a lot of variation, but there's a lot of outdoor practices that are wasteful of land and of water. They're not mulching, they're not planting intensively, because land is cheap and water is free if you're stealing it from a creek.
Yeah.
So you don't need to be efficient or as efficient as you might otherwise. The creative pressures aren't there. The question is, like, how do best practices compare for outdoor and indoor? Then you get a very different answer. So I did a separate paper recently and found, by collecting all the available data on outdoor and indoor cultivation, that best practices, outdoor cultivation, can produce more pounds of flower per square foot or per 100 square feet than indoor can, which is completely contrary to the conventional wisdom. If you go that intensive spacing, as with good horticultural practices, you can't just like plant them close and ignore them. Part B, less water per pound. And that's also totally contrary to the conventional wisdom or to the mythology. There are other reasons besides the ones you've given. Less water use indoors, less land indoors, better security. There are other reasons. So this new piece really surprised me because, again, I approached it with curiosity. Like, what would best practices look like? And this is what I found. Well, not to belabor it, but also if you want to go net zero indoors, then you need 20 times your footprint in solar panels to do that. Mm-hmm. So land use is out the window. Even shitty outdoor production is way less land intensive. And then it takes a lot of water to produce electricity. So if you also count that water for indoor cultivation, even poor practices outdoor use much less water than best practices indoor, because outdoor is using virtually no electricity, pumps here and there. It's not just organic, it's closed loop, it's how water efficient it is, how land efficient it is. Still, organic fertilizer has a carbon footprint and has other environmental impacts. It takes a lot of curiosity and R&D, but I have found cultivators, they are very rare and they keep a low profile, but we found cultivators who are doing this closed loop thing, and sure enough, they're getting high THC, gorgeous buds in non-ideal climates, I should add. So I'm very optimistic about the potential for outdoor to be enough. And also, there's just a lot of kind of assumptions that get made, like, well, we have to use buildings because there isn't enough land, or there isn't enough farmland, like we'll be displacing other crops or something. So to grow all the cannabis Americans consume, which is 34 million pounds per year, 17,000 tons. Okay. 17,000 tons per year, black market and legal together. Mm-hmm. It would take 0.003% of all American farmland. Very little. And it would take even less if it was done intensively, like we were talking about. So I think there's a there for outdoor. I think with skill, with good horticulture, with good genetics, there can be sheltering with hoop houses and things. We're just talking about artificial lighting, air conditioning, dehumidification, space heating. You have to heat these spaces because the lights aren't on 24 hours a day. So unless you're in Hawaii, you have to heat your grow room when the lights are off. So anyway, I think I'm very encouraged because I think it can be done. It's just got to be very conscious and be supported with public policy. In California, half of California land area today, it's illegal to grow outdoors. What?
I had no idea.
Yeah, I had no idea either. And while it's legal in California, it's left up to the localities to design the details of the laws and regs. Cities want the tax revenues. So the cities, if I may say, want the urban indoor cultivation because they get property taxes, they get license fees and all that. That's a conflict of interest. Rural outdoor cannabis is much more sensible and much better for the general population, even if there's a few less dollars in the pockets of the cities. The cities should not be in the business of generating tax revenues at the expense of the citizenry.
Well, I think we have learned a ton. The politics, the energy use, and the overall scenario of indoor growing, outdoor growing, and basically the whole overview of what's going on in environmental justice with regard to the marijuana industry at the present. I want to recommend highly this article, Environmental Justice Up in Smoke in Slate. I also want to recommend the writings of Evan Mills on this subject, among other things he writes about. And we want to thank you, Evan, for being back on Snap Sessions and giving us such an extraordinary look at an industry that's part of our lives.
Well, thank you, Doug, for your curiosity and energy level. It's wonderful, and all the work you do to do environmental work and to educate and to be the bearer of all the good news that there is out there.
Thanks, Evan.
And thanks to our activist of the show, environmental scientist and muckraking journalist, Evan Mills. Our production team includes Techmeister producer Marshall Brown, writer-interviewer Doug Nunn, logo designer Daniel Stieglitz, and student interns Max Oatney and Frey Barty. Don't be an airhead. Get out there and do something creative. Dabble in something that inspires you. Read something challenging. Expand your perspective. Our aim is to give you an outlook, both local and international, on the arts, and a critical look at world politics. Salute the power of creativity and foster international solidarity. Make Mother Earth great again.
Support for Snap Sessions is brought to you by listeners who contribute generously at our link, patreon.com/snapsessions, or through the link in the Snap Sessions website, thesnapsessions.com, and also the link in our show notes. Thanks to our Snappus Maximus contributors, Ron Hoxbrook and Rick and Henny Newman, and to our supportive snappers, Ellen Athens, Peter and Sheila Jowers, Kathy White, Dominique Jowers, John Bird, Gabriel Geiger, James Bartlett, and Christine Samus. Other contributors include Steve Weingarten and Jerry Shook. These supporters help keep Snap Sessions snapping. Join the Snap Sessions family today